Hello, everybody. It's Brian here with what I will say is part six of what might be a never ending series about John Cale. I mean, there's a lot to get through, so we're only on part six, and we're still in 1974. But this is a record I was originally going to skip over, but I decided to include it. It's not a John Cale solo record. It's not even a collaboration like he did with Terry Riley in the Church of Anthrax. It's a live recording with a bunch of musicians, but I thought I would throw it in also to give some flavor of what John Cale was doing in 1974. So the record I'm talking about is called June 1st, 1974. It's credited to Kevin Ayers of the Soft Machine, John Cale, of course, Velvet Underground originally, Brian Eno from Roxy Music, and of course his solo career continues to today, and Nico, originally from the Velvet Underground, and a very interesting solo career that was cut short when she tragically died as a result of a bicycle accident when I think she was still 49, hadn't quite turned 50 yet. On the back is credited to those musicians plus the Soporifics, which was Kevin Ayers' touring band, and that includes Archie Leggett, Ollie Halsall, Rabbit, and Eddie Sparrow, all pictured here, and this group of female backup singers. But also, as you'll notice, it includes Mike Oldfield and Robert Wyatt. This paragraph here describes how it all came together. Apparently, Kevin Ayers was slated to perform at the Rainbow Theatre on this date, June 1st, 1974, and decided he wanted some guests along, so he invited Nico. And through Nico was able to contact John Cale. It kind of worked out easily because John Cale was producing this record by Nico at the time. It's called The End. It's called The End because there is a cover version of The Doors' The End. So also on this record are Phil Manzanera from Roxy Music and Brian Eno. So it's all kind of ties in together. Now on this record, apart from producing it, John Cale plays bass guitar, xylophone, acoustic guitar, synthesizer, organ, marimba, cassava, glockenspiel, percussion, piano, electric piano, and perhaps most importantly, triangles, plural triangles. So through Nico, John Cale came along, and as it happens, John Cale and Brian Eno were working together on John Cale's record called Fear, which would come out in October of 1974. And of course, Brian Eno appears on this record as well. So Brian Eno came along, and it's sort of like the gang's all here. And then he describes how Mike Oldfield came along and Robert Wyatt. So it's an interesting concert that was performed in front of 3,000 people at the Rainbow Theatre in 1974. Kind of a weird, one of those things that happens, and could it ever happen again? Who knows, but kind of interesting. So 1974 is interesting because, as I mentioned, John Cale is working with Brian Eno on his new record, which would come out in October, called Fear, the first of the so-called Island Trilogy. As I mentioned, John Cale was working with Brian Eno and Nico on her record. John Cale was also producing this the Horses record from Patti Smith. So a lot of things were happening in 1974, including this particular concert. So let's have a look at this cover photo. So I thought nothing of this photo for years. By the way, I don't have a CD copy of this for whatever reason. But when I read the Wikipedia entry, it was quite alarming because it says the cover photograph was taken by Mick Rock in the foyer of the Rainbow Theatre shortly before the concert began. The bemused stare between John Cale and Kevin Ayers is said to be explained by the fact that Cale had caught Ayers sleeping with his wife the night before the show. The couple would divorce the next year. Now, it does raise some questions. Is that the way you would look at a man who has just slept with your wife? And would you actually perform in a concert with that person knowing that that had happened? It is very interesting. So, I don't know, kind of funny to think about. So John Cale features on 4 tracks on here. So I'm going to just describe the tracks and where he shows up and kind of something like that. So the first track on side A is an Eno track called Driving Me Backward, which I think is fantastic. John Cale plays viola. The second track is Babies on Fire, which I would say is my favorite Brian Eno track without question, and John Cale plays piano on that track. The other track is Heartbreak Hotel, written by Mac Axton, of course made popular by Elvis Presley. Now, that track does appear on a later John Cale record, and if you have never heard it, let me just say it's not a straight-up cover of that song. He kind of deconstructs it and puts it back together in a very aggressive, menacing, almost violent way. It's a really interesting performance. So John Cale takes lead vocals on that track with the other musicians backing him up. And it is a really, in terms of cover versions, it might be one of my favorites because it's just so unexpected. The first time I heard it was not this version, though. I heard the studio version, and it's really really interesting. So that might be the highlight. The next track is The End, which appears here, the studio version, with Nico singing with harmonium and Brian Eno. And then side B are all Kevin Ayers tracks. May I, Shouting in a Bucket Blues, Stranger in Blue Suede Shoes, Everybody's Sometime and Some People's All the Time Blues. And the last track is called Two Goes Into Four, and John Cale plays the viola on that track. So it's a really interesting collection. There are, of course, more songs were performed than were released here. So if you can track down, I've tried, I can't find it. There's a bootleg CD version which has 2 additional tracks that John Cale sings on. One's Buffalo Ballet and the other is Gun. They would appear on his next album called Fear, and I think those are top shelf John Cale records, or songs, I should say. So I've been looking for that, but never able to find it. So anyway, this is 1974. I just threw this in because of all the things, and there might be other things. I don't know everything about John Cale. He may have been doing other things, but 1974 seems to have been a busy year with producing Nico and playing on a record, doing this, recording his own music. So that's 1974, June 1st, 1974. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.